Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Trahey. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. Our next competitive advantage speaker is Jason Robbins, who's the CEO of DraftKings. His speech is entitled "The Analytics Behind Winning at Daily Fantasy Sports." The talk will run about 20 minutes, and we'll have 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. With that, I'll welcome Jason on the stage.
Thank you. So appreciate everybody taking the time to learn a little bit about daily fantasy sports. I guess just to start off, show of hands, who's ever played daily fantasy sports before? Oh, wow. Way more than I would have thought. Who's heard of it? Who's never heard of it before? One or two, not many? All right, well, I'll make the first part brief then. So just wanted to first kind of introduce everybody to what the concept is. Sounds like most here are familiar, but for those who aren't, daily fantasy sports is the fastest growing niche within the broader fantasy sports category. The difference between daily fantasy sports and fantasy sports is fantasy sports, you would play for the entire season with the same team, whereas in daily fantasy sports, you can enter competitions that last just one day, or in the case of NFL, through the NFL weekend, so 1 week. You can play a variety of different games for free or for real money prizes, and everything from 25 cents up to high stakes can be used for entry fees. So it's kind of very appealing to people who enjoy playing fantasy sports. A large percentage of fantasy sports leagues are already played for money, and this allows you to do that in more rapid fashion. And also to use, as we'll go through, way more information in numbers because you're modeling out and trying to figure out a very specific situation, what's going to happen today in this game, versus trying to pattern something over an entire season. Also, a lot of money can be won there as well. There's other daily fantasy sports sites out there. We're not the only one, but our site alone will award over $200 million in prizes this year. So for an industry that's pretty new, it's been growing very rapidly, and the amount of prizes being won are extremely high. The chart didn't come out very well. First, just wanted to kind of share the nature of the game and how it works. So it's a game of skill. Much like regular fantasy sports, people who are good at it are able to win at a much higher rate than people who aren't. This is, it looks like the chart didn't totally translate well on the Mac, but the graph here is showing the percent of players that win profit in a given week, and this is for the entirety of 2013. So it's actually remarkably consistent. It hovers around low 20% range of players that win. And over a longer period, so a month in January, that second bullet on the left, about 15% of players win. And over a much longer period, the year of 2013, about 10% of players win. And a lot of players don't continue playing. They maybe don't enjoy the game, but really that's not, the bulk of those that do win do continue playing, and of the active ones, there's still quite a few that are breaking even or not winning money. It's also interesting, there's probably about 50 to 100 people we estimate today who actually do this for a living. So, as the prize pools go larger and people get better and better at modeling and the skill edge increases, we may see quite a few more of that, but already we think there's around 50 to 100 people playing for profit today, and winning enough to be able to do that for a career. So lots of different ways that people approach this, the ones that are winning. We for this presentation and for a variety of other reasons, have spent a lot of time speaking with some of the winning players, understanding their strategies, understanding what they're doing to win in the game, and helping adopt the product experience to make it better for everyone. One big thing that a lot of the best players do is modeling. So much like normal types of quant modeling, there's a predictive variable that you're trying to establish, and usually that's the projected fantasy score for a given player in a day. And then there's several variables that are driving that. So independent variables may include things like variables surrounding the matchup today. So not just what's the team they're playing against, but a defense versus position metric. If you're a quarterback, how does the team you're playing against typically fare defensively against the quarterback? If you're a point guard, Probably the same person will be guarding the point guard on the opposing team that guards a point guard normally, so how does that position usually fare against that team defensively? Also, obviously, the way that that player himself has performed consistently on average and trends that you would see. So players, there's debate depending on sport. You may or may not believe whether players actually get hot or not, but some do, and they have trend-based stuff in their models. And then certainly in sports like baseball, even if you're not going to believe that a player gets hot, there's so much data there that if you take a lot of the elements of the, not just player themselves, but the defensive matchup, the ballpark they're playing in, the weather, really robust models can be built that predict very well. Now, that's the way the game itself works. You don't actually go and have a draft each time the way that normal fantasy sports typically works. There's almost like you're a GM of a team setup where you have a salary cap to spend and each player is priced, and that pricing is based on an algorithm that we have developed, and we do some manual tweaks as well, but it's largely algorithm driven. So the players that are really good at modeling, they have to be able to identify places the algorithm breaks down. It could be we're not that good at it, or a lot of times it could be things that involve late-breaking news. So a player that we didn't think was going to start is suddenly starting. Their price on DraftKings might be extremely low, and especially when you get late in the NFL season and you see a lot of unexpected injuries. Week 17, great week where a lot of competitive advantage can be established because there's so many players that are in first-time roles that people that can do really well at modeling out and predicting how that role produced will be able to identify value with. Other late-breaking news can be things like players on the defensive side that are out. So if all of a sudden the top cornerback is out for a team, then you would upgrade the star wide receiver of the opposing team, especially if that cornerback were a shutdown corner. And matchups in general can have an opposite effect. So there's also secondary things such as maybe on that same situation where you had a shutdown corner on one team, that star wide receiver who's been on a tear for the last 3 weeks won't really produce a whole lot. Maybe this week the second wide receiver is going to get a lot more targets because the quarterback will be avoiding the top wide receiver who's being covered by the shutdown corner. There's really just a ton that people analyze, and it's very specific and different by each sport. And a lot of people use modeling, a lot of people don't. A lot of people just try to identify value plays based on more of the elements in that second and third bullet here. Another really interesting aspect of how people win at daily fantasy sports involves game selection and understanding that picking the players has to vary. The way that you would pick the players has to be a little bit different depending on what you play. So I chose 2 very popular types of games that we offer as a case study. First are these large field tournaments that typically have top-heavy payouts. So we had a tournament last year for football that had $1 million top prize, and there were thousands of people playing in it. Also, only about 20% of the people who played actually got any money. So most weren't. And really entering a tournament like that, it's all about trying to get to that top prize, or at least get to somewhere near the top where you're going to have a really nice payday. For those types of games, you need to score better than a large field of people, and you really need to focus less on minimizing your variance. And in many ways, you actually want to maximize your variance because you need players that could have a really, really high upside even if the downside is low. So the types of players that you would choose would be ones that are kind of boom or bust. And the types of combinations you put together would be players that are correlated in value. So a great strategy for winning a tournament like that, where you just need an exceptionally high score to do really well, is to pick a quarterback and pair them with their wide receiver and tight end. You may not want to do that in other types of games I'll talk about in a moment, but in this, if the quarterback's week Peyton Manning throws for 7 touchdowns, his wide receiver and tight end are going to have very nice weeks as well. So you're really maximizing your variance there by having players that are correlated in value. Another example would be picking the 2, 3, 4 hitters out of a baseball lineup. RBIs, runs, hits are all going to be, in bunches for that group. If the second hitter gets on base and the third hitter, drives them in, then you're getting multiple stats credit if you pick both of those players. The other type of game that I've highlighted here are heads-up games, so games where you're playing against just one other player. And in those games, the strategy is completely different. You want to pick players that have fairly stable variance and maximize expected value. Because expected value here against only one opponent is much, much more impactful, and minimizing variance where you may want to not take some home run swings since you just got to beat one other person is really the right strategy. So in the first example, where we don't care at all about having a high expected value, as long as our upside is really high and as long as our variance is high enough. In the second example, it's the complete opposite. And the scores I have on that top left will highlight how this plays out. So I have those two categories there, the large field tournaments and the heads-up contests. In the large field tournaments, the winning score is 40 points higher than the minimum score to cash, and both of them are much higher, including the minimum score to has 14 points higher than what you need to win/cash. The same thing for heads-up if you're playing against one other player in the heads-up game. So you don't need to have as high an upside on that heads-up game. You do need to have much more consistency and stability, however, if you want to win, because the players that are doing well are playing a lot of volume in heads-up games. And unless you're able to put a lot of money into play consistently and keep reloading on that, stability is very important for you. So that's all I have as far as the presentation goes. I have a couple other things that I want to briefly speak to that aren't in slides, and then I figured I'd actually open it up a little early for Q&A. So first, I wanted to speak to, I think, one key difference between season-long and daily. So this daily game, as we've talked about, has that salary cap algorithm. And you can have access, if you're anyone, to any set of players. You also have access to all information about those players leading up to the day of the game. So it's a very different strategy than picking a season-long team where you have to think about which types of players you are going to want for the entire season and not necessarily great matchup this week or something like that. And you also don't have access to everyone. If you're not the first pick in the draft, you can't choose to invest in, say, Adrian Peterson if he were going to be the top draft pick this year. So it just sort of changes the slate of choices and makes things different. And I think that's an interesting element of this. And then the second thing that I wanted to speak about is I think that as more and more volume is coming into this, you will see more professional players and more people doing this for a living. So I think a lot of the interesting efforts that are going to come on the side of us, and I didn't really talk about what we're doing on the analytics side today. I talked about it from the player's perspective. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure everybody has fun and wants to continue playing. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting analytics on how do you match up people against other people that will be good for them to play against, and how do you allow for still having an open ecosystem where people can play each other but have some control over that, since it really does make a big difference in the experience. So that's all I had for the presentation. I guess open it up for questions.
So I'll walk the mic around. If you are sort of far down an aisle, try to get closer to the aisle. That would be very helpful. Thanks.
Does the daily draft allow for individual defensive player type formats?
There aren't any really that are popular today. It's full team defense the way most standard fantasy leagues are. That's something, as well as several other varieties, that will roll out over time. One thing we have to consider as we talk about rolling out other game types is part of what attracts people to this is the action there and the amount of prizes. So we're sort of slowly introducing new games, and we think having different types of games is really important. But we also want to make sure that we don't do too many where it splits it all up and the prizes aren't as interesting and people aren't able to get the games that they want.
So you mentioned getting players that are on the same team that would possibly have points that would lead to the other players on that team getting points. But, if they don't have great days, then someone who picked players on other teams might get more points. Is it worth getting the correlated players on that team for the win that probably won't be that often? I'm not sure.
So that's a great question, and that's really where you have to have a differentiated strategy depending on what you're playing. So if you're playing in those large field tournaments we're showing on the left where you really need a high score in order to be able to do well, and when you win, you're getting a prize that's many, many times your amount that you entered, you don't care quite as much about winning as often. You want to just have an opportunity to win that really high prize. So you'd absolutely want to take that strategy and live with the fact that if that quarterback, who you also picked the wide receiver and tight end on the same team with, If that quarterback throws 0 touchdowns, you're not getting any points for anybody, unless somehow the tight end rushes one in. We've seen crazy things like that happen. But in all likelihood, you're not getting any points for anybody. But you wouldn't want to do that in that other type of game at all. You'd have the exact issue you're describing where it's just too boom or bust. And I actually did mention, but there's other things you do too in the type of game where you want to have a really high score in the max scenario. You don't care about expected value. One example is making contrarian picks. So very similar, where if I'm going to pick someone that no one thinks is going to have a good game today, and on the off chance that they do, I'll be the only person that has them, or one of the few that have them on that roster. So again, it's a strategy where very high percentage of the time it's going to completely bust out, but that percentage of the time where it hits, it's going to give you a tremendous advantage over the other players in the field. And knowing when to make those types of picks and which types of games to do it in is a really, really big way that the players that play all these different games get an advantage. A lot of people would just pick one lineup and think, oh, I'll enter these 2 types of contests with the exact same team. I like it. I think these people will score well. But it's really not the right way to make profit in the long run when you're playing these games.
Thanks. So you mentioned the market briefly. I'm curious what the average player is kind of wagering at a regular basis. And then you said that there's 50 to 100 professional users. I was wondering how many users you see as being regular customers at your website.
So without getting in, I'll kind of give some high-level answers on that. So the amount that people spend definitely varies wildly. On average, it's in the hundreds per month in wager, and of that, there's a pretty big range between some people that are playing for 25 cents, $1, $2 every night, and people are playing high stakes. The regularity piece is a very seasonal product, so it varies definitely depending on what time of year it is. Football season is when you get, by far, your most number of active people, and really where we see everything spike because there's a lot going on, particularly as baseball overlaps and basketball does with just a lot of sports. And a different time of year, perhaps the middle of February or end February, like we're in now, where it's actually even worse. A few weeks ago, we had All-Star break and the Hockey Olympics. The only thing going on was college basketball. We see a pretty low number of people. People still do play the college basketball game. And the interesting thing we've also found is there's some people that enjoy the daily game so much that they'll jump in and try college basketball when there's no NBA or hockey. But certainly we see a downtick in actives during something like the All-Star break, and we see a big drop-off after football as well.
A couple weeks ago, FanDuel did a pretty revolutionary thing by limiting the number of entries that the users could do to $250 or 250 entries a game. How do you feel that it's going to affect the 50 to 100 professionals? And also, you mentioned kind of protecting the ecosystem of the new users. Are you planning on doing anything like that in the future as well?
So FanDuel is one of the other competitors to DraftKings that does this sort of game, and we share a lot of players, so we get questions like that. So without knowing the specific details around exactly why FanDuel did that, I'm going to speculate a bit here and then speak to how we've thought about it. So I would imagine that the reason FanDuel did that is to get people who are professional players to stop playing the $1 and $2 games. Because there's the majority of volume that these players are getting is going to be well under the 250 game threshold. It's just to stop them from playing a lot of the really small stakes games where there's a lot of new or casual recreational players that they don't really need to play. It's very meaningless in terms of impacting their profit. But the nature of the game, once you create a lineup, it's just so easy to be like, sure, I'll enter it in all these $1 games that someone wants to play, that people used to do that. The way we've approached it is we've taken some of the players that we know are professionals, and we've reached out to them and just asked them not to play the low dollar games. And we do not currently have anyone who's playing more than 200 games a day even. So we'd rather, our preference, and we'll just have to adapt this over time, is to try not to have any formal restrictions on the ecosystem like that, and more to take those types of players and just ask them for, sort of respect for the other players in the game, not to play those. And we've never once had anyone that said no, that had any problem with it. If we did end up encountering that type of thing, then we'd have to put a more formal rule in place, but so far we haven't had to. And as far as the professional players question goes, I do not think it will impact it because the majority of the money those people are making are not in the games that they're giving up to stay under that threshold. And I would also imagine that that threshold, as the overall pool increases, will get lifted as well. I can't, again, speak for what FanDuel would do, but that would be my guess.
You mentioned talking to all the top players about what they were doing. Is that in order to find inefficiencies in your own algorithm, in order to value things better so that it kind of levels the playing field?
Exactly. So there's really two reasons for it. One is we want to understand just how the people that are passionate about it, are spending time in it, are using the product, what types of things they're looking at, and we're actually going to start to introduce some of those things onto our product. So we've already put a few additional stats into the drafting process, like being able to look at the defense versus a specific position, being able to look at what the starting lineups are today, the depth charts, so you can see if someone's injured, who's getting plugged in. And we want to start adding more and more analytics tools. So a lot of it is to understand from like a product perspective how we can improve the experience for everyone by taking the things that we know matter and are helping people win, and within reason, obviously. You don't want to make it no fun where there's nothing, but having some level of information and analysis that people can do on our product. And then the second reason is exactly what you said. And it's always a tricky balance there because you don't want to have it be perfect. The game is fun if people can identify ways that they feel like they're getting a good deal on a player, or picks that other people won't have. But we do want to, as much as possible, understand if there's any glaring holes in the salary cap algorithm or the way that we've set up the games in general that are allowing people to exploit it, and start to close some of those up.
In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that this is a game of skill. Is that how you guys position it to get by from the legality point of it, as opposed to classifying as a game of chance? And what kind of pressures have you been getting from legislative bodies?
I think just to familiar, the general law, and it varies a little bit state by state, allows for games of skill, and specifically carves out fantasy sports as a game of skill to have entry fee and prize-based competitions under certain stipulations, which we comply with. And there's lots of other products out there. You can play in chess tournaments for money. Lots of different things that are skill-based gaming, including games that you might not think, like video games and Bejeweled and stuff like that. There's websites and places you can play those for money. So that is why this is permissible versus other things like sports betting and poker that are not carved out in the skill-based gaming category. And as far as pressure, we haven't really gotten any. I think that probably the most that I experienced that are getting questions on it and getting people who maybe were doing partnerships or establishing relationships with it that want to do some diligence on it, and we're happy to provide the data that shows player win rates and other things that clearly point towards it being skill-based. But generally, once that process is unfolded and we're able to share it, it's pretty clear that it is a game of skill. And in some ways, that makes it more challenging for us because the flip side of it is that the less skill it is, the more a new player can come in and do well, and that leads to more. And that's something that we have to think about when we think about matching and how do we introduce people. We've established beginner games, for example, where if you've played a certain number of games, you aren't allowed to play in it anymore. And something like that is, and here's the really interesting part, when we then come back to the game of skill, it's going to actually change the win rates because you're matching people up, but it's not taking the skill out of it. It's just finding ways to match people who are going to be at similar skill levels. And really, there's just kind of like an endless amount of analysis you can look at to understand how that gets both maintained as a skill game, and you try to bridge the gap by having people of similar skill levels competing more often.
With all the advancements in analytics across all sports, there's kind of been new ways to evaluate players. I mean, it'd be probably easiest to use in baseball. Do you have any plans for like a sabermetric scoring type system that has been rolled out or will roll out?
We've talked about having games that have like really, really deep stats that go like into sabermetrics and things. I think it's in that same category where there's certainly an audience for it, especially when you think about baseball, right? Right now, we probably won't, just because we don't want to take away. We want to make sure that we continue to build the action within the game set that we offer, but probably in the next year or two, we're going to start to really expand into more different variations like that, and a deeper stats version is high on our list.
So I think we have time for one more.
You were identifying that one of the advantages is to like pick a backup, like a Mike Ayata or whatever that guy's name was, when Adrian Peterson goes down suddenly for a game. Is that because you guys can't adjust the salary because some other people have already set their lineups? So that's just kind of like a permanent advantage moving forward?
That's exactly right. So I mean, the whole strategy on looking players who specifically target and look for late-breaking news, they're looking for things that happened after the algorithm, after the salaries and games were posted. Because once people, I got asked once, like, why don't you adjust the salary afterwards? And we spoke to some customers, and the feedback was just very poor on that. Once people go and enter a game where they picked a team, they don't want to know that someone else could come in and have a different set of salaries that they're using. So they are what they are once they get posted. And exactly what you said is what people are looking for. They're looking for things that happened after the games were posted and couldn't possibly be reflected in the salaries.
All right, thanks everyone, and thanks Jason. That's all the time we have.